G'day, ZiggyD here and welcome back for some more Path of Exile beta. In this video I want to talk about the new changes to Arctic Armor, or I should say, the new Arctic Armor skill that's been added to the game. Because this is a completely different skill to the previous skill. It is still very similar in the theme. It's got that iciness to it, and it does mitigate physical and fire damage in some fashion, and it does leave an icy trail on the ground. So thematically it's very much the same skill, but in terms of actual function, Arctic Armor is completely different now. Different builds are going to be using it. It's not used by the same niche that it was used by before. It's less effective overall, I would say, but more available to more builds. So, let's run through what the changes to Arctic Armor are, and I'll give you some of my, I guess, initial impressions of the change, and we can sort of move forwards from there. Maybe we can have a bit of a discussion in the comments too. So the first thing to know is that Arctic Armor now persists through zones. Let's start with a very positive change for Arctic Armor. As you can see, I don't need to reactivate it whenever I go into a new zone. Yes! So good. I've been wanting this for a long time. And I guess this is due to the fact that now Arctic Armor is now an actual reservation skill. So, it's essentially a bit like a Herald. It is a buff that reserves some of your mana. It is not like an aura. It's not actually an aura, so it can't be scaled with aura effectiveness, so none of that works. But you can scale the reservation with mana reservation nodes, like, for example, these dudes over here, reduced mana reservation will lower its actual mana reservation, but it starts off at 25% mana reserved. So this means it's either it's available now as an alternative to running a Herald. So let's say you think, I was going to run Herald of Ice for a bit more damage, but I think I want to be a little more survivable. Instead, I'm going to change it out for Arctic Armor. So it opens it up to builds like that. It also means now that Arctic Armor isn't limited to basically the niche of super high mana regeneration builds. You know, there's mana regeneration builds that stack a heap of mana, regeneration. Used to get the old Eldritch Battery, but in the new game get basically just as much mana and mana regeneration as possible. Now that is no longer the case. Mana regeneration doesn't have any impact on Arctic Armor. There is no mana drain on Arctic Armor. There is no moving mana drain, there is no stationary mana drain, it is just a flat reservation, so much more simpler now and available to more builds overall. This means things like bow builds, melee builds can take advantage of this. As long as they can afford the dexterity and intelligence and can afford the mana reservation, then you can now use the new Arctic Armor. You don't need to worry about that mana regeneration whatsoever, whereas before it was mostly limited to casters for the most part. Casters, you know, usually synergize really well with Mind Over Matter, because with Mind Over Matter you'd be going for high mana and high mana regeneration as well. And Arctic Armor paired perfectly with that. Now there's actually not that inherent synergy anymore. So in short, Arctic Armor available for more builds, less focused on the one niche, is now a mana reservation, so is probably a trade-off instead of running a Herald. That's kind of the lowdown for how you actually support Arctic Armor now. So let's talk instead on the flip side of things, what does Arctic Armor actually give you? What are you getting in return for that 25% mana reserved? Now, rather than flat damage mitigation of physical and fire damage like it was previously, you now get a percentage less multiplier against physical and fire damage. So this means it is equivalently as effective against smaller hits and larger hits. It does mean that Arctic Armor is going to be much less noticeable as a skill. You're not going to have those mind-blowing moments where you're all of a sudden you level up your Arctic Armor and you stand in front of a Void Bearer and take no damage. So it's a little less cool. The skill is a little less unique and interesting now because you're going to take a little less damage from everything, basically. Everything that deals physical and fire damage, you're going to take a little less damage. That's about it. Like, it's not going to be that super noticeable, complete mitigation of some things and almost no mitigation of other things like Arctic Armor used to be. Now it's about an even mitigation of everything. Now, a less multiplier of around, 8 to 10% is, it is a noticeable amount. It is something that will just enhance or be an extra layer on top of your character, making them a little extra, giving them a little extra survivability. It's going to be really nice on melee characters that are also using armor and also have fortified buff up. It's going to be a nice addition to bow characters as well, giving them a little less, giving them a little more physical mitigation. It's going to help deal with reflect and things like that as well. And it's not quite as potent as a defensive mechanic for spellcasters now, I think, since it doesn't synergize with as many of the other things, and because it actually synergizes less with Mind Over Matter now, since it's actually taking away a part of your unreserved mana. I think this is mostly like more useful as a defensive mechanic for those melee, for those bow characters, for those attack-based characters. Still available to some spellcasters, but I don't think as useful as the previous Arctic Armor would be to those characters that could run the previous Arctic Armor within that high mana regeneration niche. Now, the really important part of this, though, and kind of the drawback to this, is that this mitigation, this physical and fire damage mitigation, only protects you while you're stationary. So if you're moving around, there is no mitigation. There is no fire and physical mitigation. That buff is essentially off of my character at the moment. It is only available once my character is actually standing still. Now, this is a little interesting. It means that if you are attacking, you're going to be taking less damage. It's going to do a pretty good job of mitigating against reflect, since generally you're taking reflect damage as you're standing still, unless you're using something like a ball lightning skill, something where you're moving around a lot as your skills are going out on the field. Then I think that this skill is not good, straight up not good for builds like that use things like ball lightning. But for anything that channels like flame blast, or any attack-based build or spell-based build, or anything where you stand and cast a few times or attack a few times, let's say you're a melee character using multi-strike, and then it's going to be a decent defensive mechanic. It's going to work well for you then. It's going to be up when you want it most of the time. But for anything that's very kiting heavy or very movement heavy, something that attacks once and then moves, and then attacks once and then moves, or something like ball lightning builds, as I mentioned, where your ball lightnings are traveling as you're moving around, then I think Arctic Armor is going to be less effective. Now, the other defensive mechanics are still, this ice trail is still laid on the ground, a potent way of slowing enemies and applying the chilled effect. In addition to that, you now chill enemies that hit you for half a second when you're hit. Now, quality on Arctic Armor is no longer move speed as well. I believe it is now skill effect duration, which increases the the duration of the ice on the ground, and also the chill duration when enemies actually hit you. Now, this applies to all enemies that hit you, no matter what they're hitting you with, as long as it's not a degen, as long as it's something that actually initially hits you. So a bow attack, a spell, or a melee attack, all of those enemies are going to get chilled. So there's some nice synergy with hypothermia there, and it's a nice little extra defensive mechanic. And now that does apply when you're moving or when you're stationary as well. So what are my overall thoughts on this? I think overall, this Arctic Armor is way weaker than the previous Arctic Armor. I think it's maybe a little too weak. For the mana reservation of 25%, the amount of mitigation this gives you, and the fact that you need to be stationary for it to take effect, I think is potentially 2 weeks. Now, I like the idea behind it. I like the idea that it's a skill that has different states, and potentially promotes and synergizes well with different types of gameplay. There's something to think about there. It's an interesting mechanic overall, but I do think it is too weak. There's too many drawbacks to this. A mana reservation that's, trading off a good amount of damage on a herald or something like that, or trading off, mana on your mind over matter build for a bit of mitigation. Now, it's a decent mitigation mechanic because it is a less damage multiplier, but I think with the fact that you also have to be stationary for it to take effect, I think that it's a bit too defensively weak for the trade-offs that you're getting. That's kind of my initial feeling and assessment of the skill just there. Obviously, this is very early days, and we could find that it's a pretty decent buff, and it's pretty easy to run in a bunch of builds that didn't have access to it before, so it's going to be a nice defensive mechanic. Like, ignoring the old Arctic Armor, it's going to be a nice defensive mechanic for builds that couldn't run the old Arctic Armor, really, or builds that didn't have this defensive mechanic available now, all of a sudden have a new skill where they can get a whole bunch of less physical and fire damage taken, and another way of chilling enemies, so there is some potential there. I doubt this will be the final iteration of this Arctic Armor. I think we'll probably see some more changes over the course of the beta. I think this is kind of just their initial trial run of this Arctic Armor, and it seems like overall the community is not very happy with the change. I'm kind of able to forget about the old Arctic Armor and look at this by itself and think that I kind of like this idea behind this new Arctic Armor. I like this as a skill by itself. I don't think it's as interesting or as good as the previous Arctic Armor, but I do like that it's becoming available for more builds that are kind of cool to have it. For example, bow characters having access to this, I think is kind of cool. So I think there's some potential here, but there's definitely more work that needs to be done on it for the beta. So anyway, guys, if you guys are on the beta and playing a build that might be able to explore the use of this Arctic Armor, give it a go. Let me know what you think. I'm going to be testing it on this character a bit, but but I think I've determined, since I'm using Mind Over Matter, which is in this awesome new position here between Witch and Templar, I think that on this character, I'm probably going to drop Arctic Armor, because it just doesn't synergize well with Mind Over Matter anymore. It's just not a very helpful defensive mechanic. I think the power that I'm getting for it is not worth the trade-off of actually sacrificing that mana, even after I reduce this mana reservation down to, you know, below 20. I still don't think it's going to be quite worth it on this particular character. Curious though, I'm curious to try it on like some bow builds and things like that in the future potentially, and I do hope that ZiggyD pays a bit more attention to it and works on it a little bit more given some of the community feedback. Anyway, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. That is it for now. I am ZiggyD, and thanks for watching.